Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Feng accused the U.S. of treating China as an imaginary enemy and trying to suppress China during talks with the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman in Tianjin today. The two countries have continued to clash across a range of fronts in past months since their first high-level meeting in Alaska in March. According to Feng, the China-U.S. relationship is now in the stalemate and faces serious difficulties. So what are the difficulties and what are the solutions needed to narrow the differences and come to some common understanding? To discuss these issues, I'm pleased to be joined by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics from East China Normal University, and Rick Dunham, former White House correspondent for Business Week. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Hello, welcome to the show, gentlemen. Here I want to quote the Vice Foreign Minister Feng. That's what he said during these talks. He said, the bilateral relationship between the two countries are now in a stalemate and face serious difficulties, fundamentally because some Americans portray China as an imaginary or imagined enemy. Victor, I will start with you. As imagined enemy or imaginary, what does it refer to here?
Well, I think there are people in Washington who treat China as an enemy or a presumptive enemy in a sense, or imagined enemy. This is very bad because they want to do whatever they can to hold China down, and they want to do this even at the risk of depriving the Chinese people of their right of economic development. And from the Chinese perspective, this probably is the biggest crime against humanity, because how can you deprive the Chinese people of their right of economic development and improving their living standards? So there are people in Washington who treat China-U.S. relations as a zero-sum game. Whatever China gains by economic development is considered as a loss on the American side. This is very ossified. This is truly a very Cold War mentality. And I think China is against this, and Vice Foreign Minister Feng made it very clear, and he put forward two different lists, asked the Americans to rectify their mistakes. So I think we need to see how the American side respond to this. But allow me to say one thing. War is not an option between China and the United States because both countries are fully armed with nuclear weapons, and any attempt to strike at the other side with nuclear weapon will definitely trigger a nuclear retaliation leading to Armageddon, as Dr. Henry Kissinger said many times recently. So I think we need to figure out a way to get along with each other, and China-U.S. need to live and let live. That's the very important megatrend in the world of today, and I hope Deputy Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman and her colleagues in the State Department and in the U.S. government will need to come to full awareness of this megatrend between China and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, obviously, Vice Foreign Minister Feng used a word like a stalemate to describe the current relationship status between China and the U.S. Obviously, it has something to do with what we discussed, the fundamental mentality, whether it's a zero-sum relationship or is a cooperative relationship between the two countries. Is a stalemate, that's the situation between the two countries now.
Yeah, I think stalemate is the right word. I don't think we've seen much progress since the meetings in Alaska, and what we've seen on the one hand is the U.S. has reinforced and extended its anti-China narrative in global discourse, but on the other hand, despite Biden's team being much better at diplomacy than Trump's team, despite some minor diplomatic wins in its efforts against China, it has not been effective at rallying the world, even its own allies, against China. So I think the word stalemate is entirely appropriate here.
Well, Rick, Xie Feng also said, the relationship is facing a series of difficulties. Remind us, what are the existing problems, challenges between the two most powerful countries, let's say?
There are a lot of difficulties on both sides. With the U.S., there's been a lot of rhetoric about human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. There has been very strong pushback about Taiwan, also about hacking. Either the United States government has accused the Chinese government or its authorized hackers of hacking into Microsoft systems. So there is really expanded rhetoric that the United States has. You also have the leftover Trump sanctions, which were not immediately lifted by the Biden administration. Sanctions against a number of Chinese government officials related to the alleged human rights abuses. And you have these tariffs. So you have a large number of friction points from the U.S. Point of view, and they see the Chinese government responding with this apocalyptic rhetoric rather than sitting down to negotiate. So that's sort of the perspective from Washington.
With the perspective from Washington, obviously, if you follow that direction, see, it is as if, I'm quoting Xie Feng here, as if like when China's development is contained, all U.S. domestic and external challenges will go away, and the U.S. would become great again, and Pax Americana would continue to go on. And also there's a whole of government and whole of a society approach campaign is being waged to bring China down. Obviously, this is also refers to, at least some people in Washington, having this mentality, Victor.
Indeed, I think the great necessity in the world today is for American decision makers to come to the conclusion that, first of all, China is not an enemy of the United States. And then the second point is even more important. The worst enemy of the United States is actually the United States itself. It needs to get its act together. It needs to get racial discrimination over in the United States. It needs to come to terms with lots of issues inside the United States, rather than blaming China as if China is the root cause of all its problems. Now, the other point, I think, is whatever the United States decide to do, China will continue to develop. And in no time, the size of the Chinese economy will need to surpass that of the United States. This is a megatrend. No one in the United States or anywhere else in the world can stop this megatrend. So it's better to come to realization and to come to terms with this megatrend rather than standing in the way, try to derail this peaceful rise of the Chinese economy and the continued improvement of the living standards of the Chinese people. Now, if decision makers in Washington do not come to terms with these realities, then they will indulge in their fantasy on the one hand, or go into very wrongful decisions and huge mistakes, for example, and eventually these huge mistakes may come back to haunt them. So I think the United States need to come back to its sanity rather than indulge in fantasy or indulge in delusion in its relations with China.
Well, Mahoney, you are nodding. Victor was speaking. Obviously, this is a very important relationship, not only to the two peoples, the two countries, but also to the rest of the world. And we know that, of course, if you want to find a solution to these challenges and difficulties, you need to understand correctly what is the root causes of the problem. And also, there's a fundamental, like a prospect or question, American, probably the people should think about it, if China surpass, as Victor said, like surpass the U.S. to become the largest economy, are people ready to accept that kind of reality in Washington?
I think the problem is much bigger than that. I think the key to this is that, in China, with the way the Chinese political system works, and particularly after 2012, where China began to deal with some of its own systemic crises that had crept up over the years, what we have in Beijing is a hyper-rational actor. And in the United States, we don't have that at all. Now, there's the famous American author Gore Vidal once described the United States as the United States of amnesia. In other words, it never remembers anything and therefore never learns anything. But I think the problem, and Victor used the right word here, is much bigger. There's a fantasy, there's a disconnect from reality. I think we have to recall that half the United States doesn't trust its political system. Half the United States sees its president and leaders as illegitimate. Half don't believe in the vaccine. Half don't believe that humans are responsible for global warming or that it's even a real crisis. And the only thing where we really see much more than half at work is more than half believing that China is in some way an existential threat to the United States and the world at large. So there's this complete disconnect from reality, right? There's this type of schizoid, bipolar way of thinking that's taking place in Washington. And I'm really not very confident. You know, back when Victor and I were talking about the Alaska meeting, he and I were both optimistic that we might see a return to reality, some sort of return to pragmatism, at least a soft reset in relations. And I think what we have to come to terms with is that U.S. hegemony and imperialism has always required an enemy, from the Cold War to the War on Terror to the present. But more so, you know, currently the U.S. Also needs a scapegoat for its own systemic crises. And as the rising power, as the number 2 power, as an Asian and communist power, China is the inevitable target.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, what do you make of that? You know, obviously there are, you know, fundamental, very challenging issues facing the Biden administration domestically. You know, those problems are not from China, but at the same time, somehow people would say the U.S. does need an enemy outside, like China probably fit that some profile to help the U.S. to reunify the society, the country, and then to reignite, you know, the purpose of the nation. Is that the case?
Well, I come at it from a slightly different perspective. While a lot of this is true about bipartisan opposition to Chinese policies in the United States, I don't think that there is universal belief that a new Cold War is inevitable. Yes, there is a lot of old Cold War rhetoric, particularly on the Republican right and among the Trumpists about China. And there is criticism of China on human rights from Democrats. But I do think what Wendy Sherman was saying about cooperation is very similar to the kind of rhetoric from Xi Jinping in the early years of the last decade, whereas we cooperate where we can cooperate and we compete otherwise. I think that there still is a feeling in the Biden administration that it is possible to do both at the same time, to talk about climate change, to talk about international terrorism, to talk about other issues where the two countries have similar interests at the same time having these disagreements. However, I think that the Chinese government is now using rhetoric that was similar to the Trump era rhetoric from the United States. And I think that the Biden administration is going to continue with a harder line than the Obama and Bush administrations, but trying to cool the rhetoric of the Trump administration. So, yeah, I see it as a little different. I don't see this as a question of American hegemony in the world. I see it as two very powerful nations trying to influence other nations in the world right now.
Well, Rick, you mentioned about, you don't see a Cold War is upcoming, but many people would say the Biden's China policy actually is stronger, is more hardline toward China than the Trump administration. For example, the Chinese list, it says that, China requires demand the U.S. side, to lift the visa restrictions on the CPC members, their families, Chinese students, lifting sanctions imposed on Chinese leaders, government officials, and agencies, removing restrictions on Confucius Institute and Chinese companies, etc., over there. These are the actual remnants of the Trump administration. Why can't the Biden government simply, remove that and have a new, getting back to normal relationship with China?
Yep. You've gotten that. This is a very important point that you raise. And I think it's something that needs to be done if the relationship will be improved. I think that what the situation is the Biden administration would like something from China in return, rather than just simply saying, we're going to give you something. It's not very diplomatic to just say, we give up, we were wrong. I think they're looking for something from China. Right now, what they're getting from the Chinese Foreign Ministry is very heated rhetoric. So I think that there is potential for, especially on these issues of visas and some of the most extreme measures from the Trump administration. There's room for movement, but I think that the Biden administration is trying to leverage any power that they have to try to get something for it, rather than just to cave in. And what the other speakers have said about domestic political pressures, I think is right. Joe Biden doesn't have a lot of maneuvering room right now. I mean, the Republicans in the United States, many do not believe in his legitimacy. And so I think that he has a very narrow band of space to actually maneuver politically to improve the relations. And so I don't think it's really a hard line that he has. It's a lot harder than other previous American presidents pre-Trump.
Obviously, Professor Mahoney here, speak of rhetoric. The U.S. side before this recent meeting talked about, speaking to China from a position of strength and guardrails, in particular, position of strength. Sometimes people see that as, from a position of being superior. U.S. is a prime country, superior to other countries here in the case of China-U.S. relationship. What's your understanding of speaking from the position of strength, Professor Mahoney?
I think it's really kind of a mixed message. In English, I don't think position of strength necessarily conveys that one is superior, but rather that one is resolute and has solidified their position vis-a-vis their adversary or whoever they're in dialogue with. And I think that's what the United States is trying to convey. I think Biden is trying to suggest that some of his small victories in diplomacy indicate that the U.S. has returned to some sort of alliance that may be effective in containing China. And so this is the position of strength that I think he's talking about. I don't think anyone in the U.S. right now is particularly enamored with the idea of the U.S. being domestically or even internationally in a position of strength. Above all, because so many people feel vulnerable to our own problems, vulnerable to global problems, and most amazingly, vulnerable to China. So this position of strength thing is really kind of a shell game in terms of language. As far as guardrails, I drive up and down American highways all the time, and we have these guardrails on the side of the highway, and they're crumpled because people keep crashing into them, and they're really designed to absorb crashes. I'm not sure that anyone ever really survives hitting the guardrail, and I know that Biden wants to have a return to a hotline or some other means for communicating in a moment of crisis. But I think the Chinese position is you want this because you want to constantly push us to the point of crisis and then be able to call things back and call things down and return to some sort of safe normal where you can keep the pressure on, and we don't want that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Victor, what's the Chinese side thinking about this? Guardrail, is that bottom line or strengthening of position of strength? Speaking to the Chinese side, if you look at as Professor Mahoney rightly pointed out, if you look at many aspects, actually the U.S. is not exactly in the position of strength. For example, pandemic prevention and control. For example, in terms of free trade and investment, China is the largest trading partner of many more economies than the U.S. and also industrial power. China is the factory of the world. So I don't know, what's the position of strength?
Well, talking about position of strength, it can be both subjective and objective. I think from the Chinese perspective, China probably means that the United States objectively does not have a position of strength vis-a-vis China. However, subjectively, whether the United States believes it has a position of strength or not, that's purely subjective. In historical terms, I think General MacArthur back in 1950 thought his army did have a position of strength vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis Chinese people's volunteers. But what's the end of that kind of speculation? For example, MacArthur was defeated and he lost his job because of his failures in the Korean War. Therefore, I personally believe it's not worthwhile to argue about a position of strength between one party versus the other. The real thing that truly matters is, philosophically speaking, for example, what China and the United States need to look at each other. Do we really look at each other as enemies, or do we look at each other as, for example, an inevitable peace? I actually have advocated that the peace between China and the United States is actually inevitable rather than China and the United States destined to war. Why? Because both countries are nuclear armed. Both countries can strike back at the other side multiple times and destroy the other side multiple times, triggering a true Armageddon. So what's the fun of that? The real fun of that is that we decide to get along. We decide that peace is the megatron between China and the United States, and both China and the United States need to figure out a better way to engage with each other. That's the guardrail, I suppose, so that we do not violate the bottom line of the other side. We set up a new red line of issues, for example, and we respect each other rather than keep provoking each other or try to push the other side to the corner, because that will really trigger escalation of tensions between China and the United States. And if any war breaks out between China and the United States, it will very instantly lead to Armageddon. So decision makers in Washington and in Beijing need to be fully aware that they are not talking about child play. They are really talking about life or death of human civilizations. So calm down and use sanity and use reason rather than hot rhetorics, rather than, for example, urging for war or destined for war, such rhetoric to mislead themselves as well as mankind.
Well, coming back to sense, obviously, trying to achieve peace is more challenging than going to war, in a sense. So, Rick, if you compare the recent meetings to the previous high-level meeting in Alaska, do you see this as a continuation and probably more productive? After all, I think both sides are very clear of each other about your interests, about your proposals. Everything is on the table now.
Yeah, I think marginally these meetings in Tianjin were a little more productive than the meetings in Alaska, but I think that they mostly resulted in domestic propaganda on both nations, just repeating the talking points to their own media. If you look at coverage in the United States of the meetings in Tianjin, it's polar opposite of the coverage in China. So I think that they were aimed at domestic audience. To me, the way to tell whether there's any success is whether at the G20 upcoming meetings, there is a one-on-one meeting between Presidents Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. I think that this was laying the groundwork for that, and it will be seen as very bad for the two nations' relations if the two leaders do not meet when they are in the same country, in the same meeting hall. So I think that that's where we look ahead, and I really do hope that the two can speak again. They spoke so many times when Joe Biden was vice president of the United States and Xi Jinping was vice president of China, and then leading up to his presidency. So I hope that they can speak again and move toward more cooperation and less confrontation. But we'll see. We just can't tell out of this meeting in Tianjin.
Well, when the meeting was taking place, you see other itineraries of the U.S. officials. U.S. Defense Secretary Austin is set to travel to Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit India. Professor Mahoney, what do you make of that visits, by the two senior officials while China and the U.S. are trying to talk to each other?
I think it's a choreography from the Biden administration. Anytime we've seen them reaching out to China, even with this meeting, which I agree was really, I think, serving the Biden administration, not only in terms of its domestic propaganda, but also its global propaganda with its allies. In other words, see, look, we're reaching out, we're being reasonable, we're going to China, we're talking to them, we want to talk about guardrails. This is all trying to frame the U.S. as being a reasonable, rational actor. But in order to do even that, given Biden's political enemies that still exist on the right, and even his very vulnerable position on the left with regard to China and the United States, he still has to, deploy these other agents of foreign policy to talk up anti-China, if not containment efforts. So I think we're just seeing the dance continue.
Well, Victor, how do you see this basically half a year already for the Biden presidency? His China strategy, China policy is being shaped largely, though the review is yet to be completed. But largely, people see a clear picture of his China policy. Do you think somehow he has to be in a sense, had to be hardline on China because the middle-term election is upcoming next year? Somehow can't afford, if you look at it domestically, can't afford it to be soft, quote unquote, on China.
Well, based on the first 6 months of President Biden's administration, it's very clear that President Biden is a very weak president. The domestic political situation is very, very challenging and very tough for the president, and the bipartisan rivalry between the Republicans, many of whom are still Trumpists, and the Democrats are very, very much heating up, leading to the midterm election, as you mentioned, and also the presidential election in 2024. Internationally speaking, lots of challenges. The pandemic is still there, etc. The hyperinflation is happening as we speak, you name it. Therefore, in this very complicating situation, I believe China-U.S. relations actually can be a situation, if handled properly, which can gain for the Biden administration. Why? Because China can really do a lot to help America create more jobs, improve its economic development, in rolling out the infrastructure, for example, you name it. China should be viewed as a resource that can be used for the betterment of the United States, rather than as an enemy or as a hostile foreign force, for example. So I think decision makers in Washington really need to get to the reality of the world today and really size up the true nature of China-U.S. relations, rather than get this very important relation completely wrong.
Well, Rick, briefly, obviously, in terms of trade and investment, that's, in the mutual interest of the two nations. Even when it comes to the inflation, the import for the Chinese low-priced products and services actually could help the U.S. in that sense.
That's correct. And I think that it benefits both nations to improve the trade relationship. I think that is separate from the other issues. But during the Trump administration, the whole idea of trade deficit became central. I think that has to leave, and we have to figure out ways to deal with those economic ties in a way that moves both countries forward.
Well, many thanks to Victor, Rick, and Professor Mahoney. That's it for today, and thank you for watching. See you next time.